Hello, hi, welcome to the first Encounter Smith RPG show. It's a working title, so if you hate it, don't worry. My name is Tony Rodriguez, and I will be your Encounter Smith. Here on this corner of the internet, I try to become a better game master every day by coming up with new ways to make my TTRPG games and D&D games more engaging for my players and more approachable for myself and other game masters. Hopefully, all of that will help you also improve your game experiences. So, in this first episode, I'm going to break this down into three talking points. First, we're going to talk about who the heck am I and what you can expect from the show in the future. Then we will talk about, we're going to have a discussion. Normally, we will have a guest to have this discussion with, but ideally, we'll discuss a topic that has been plaguing the TTRPG community. And the one we'll talk about today is why a lot of people think martial classes in D&D 5th edition are significantly weaker than spellcasters. We will talk about that after some research I've done. And then this third section, we're going to talk about the free magic item I'm giving you for free. Game design is something I'm super passionate about, even outside of TTRPGs for like card games and board games. So making mechanics for homebrew items is something I really like doing. So I am making magic items for these episodes. I'll also be making subclasses and monsters and what have you. And not only give them to you for free, tell you what they do, but tell you why I've made those decisions in hopes that you also might feel comfortable in making your own homebrew items that don't break your game, but also feel satisfying. But if not, you can just take my free stuff and do what you will. So let's get into our first discussion, which is like, who the heck am I and why are you here? What can you expect from watching this content? Well, my name is Tony Rodriguez. I call myself your Encounter Smith because I am here to learn more and then offer you everything I've learned in hopes that it would make you more comfortable in coming up with stuff for your own game, or just taking my stuff and running your own game, whether that's Dungeons and Dragons or any other TTRPG. I have been a dungeon master for a little over 5 years, more seriously, probably a little bit more than that. And I've been playing D&D on and off since 3.5th edition. Career-wise, I am a theme park performer, which sounds very vague, but I have done a lot. I am an actor, improv actor, an atmospheric actor. I'm a stilt walker. I'm a bit of a dancer. I've done some stunts. I've done extreme pogoing. Theme parks are constantly coming up with new ways to try to entertain their guests, and I have been the guinea pig for many of them. I have done that. I've worked at several theme parks along the East Coast of America, like Busch Gardens in both Virginia and Florida. I've worked at Universal Studios in Orlando, as well as Walt Disney World, directly and indirectly through third-party companies, doing lots of things. In general, though, I have done a lot of atmospheric acting, which is very similar to just improv acting. You have to be trained and improved in a lot of the intellectual properties that these parks have. So inherently, I have to learn how to take the questions and comments of guests and reply to them as very specific characters. That is very synergistic with running TTRPGs and improving role-playing moments with NPCs and players. So plus that, with my inherent love of game design, it was a very easy choice to get really too involved into Dungeons and Dragons and other TTRPGs. But along the way in my career of theme park work for well over 10 years, I've met a lot of other super talented improv actors, performers, and game masters. So I will be interviewing them a lot on this channel. So not only are you going to learn things from my experience, but things from other really talented performers who also game master. So hopefully you will always be able to pick up something from someone. Then I also just really want to get better at making homebrew items. Whether that's characters, monsters, subclasses. Again, I have a huge passion for games design, and I like to make things that for 5th edition specifically, but other TTRPGs that are not only just satisfying to have at the game table and to have your players experience, but to have some sort of balance. So it feels good when you use them. It doesn't feel overpowered or over weak, but also still feels with the theme of whatever it is. We'll talk a whole lot about game design, theme, and balancing, because that's what I like doing. But if you're not interested in any of that, I will constantly be coming up with new magic items and supplement materials for your TTRPGs that I'll just give you. You know, maybe one day I'll make a profit off of them, but for now, I would rather make something that I thought was very cool and have you guys try it. And any feedback would be awesome. So I'm constantly going to try to get better, like in terms of making those resources. So hopefully you will too. Also, something else I'm super passionate about when it comes to TTRPGs are the mental health benefits that role-playing and TTRPGs can provide. I married a therapist, not for that reason, but she is a therapist, and we like studying mental health together and learning about that topic more and more, and the different things your brain does when you're portraying a different character and how it can give you benefits in the real world. So we will discuss that and some of the really cool ways TTRPGs can help you mentally, and I will vet all that information through my certified therapist of a wife, so I'm not completely feeding you BS on those topics. But yeah, that's pretty much what I'm doing here for you on this show. So let's get to the next topic. And this will be our first discussion. Again, in the future, I will probably be having this discussion with an interviewed guest. But for now, I found a topic that I've seen a lot since I've started playing in 5th edition, and I've never seen anyone really take the time to break it down. So we're going to talk about the fact that some people seem to think that the martial classes in D&D 5th edition are much weaker, or maybe at least just not as satisfying as spellcasters in 5th edition. So first of all, just to break the ice, they're not weaker. I've done some math, and in general, martial classes, and what I mean by martial classes are the classes in D&D 5th edition that are traditional melee based. So I'm talking like your fighters, your barbarians, rogues, rangers, paladins to an extent. But the ones who don't get that full access of a bunch of spells, like your sorcerers, wizards, clerics, what have you, the damage that they do isn't bad at all. If you do a lot of the calculations, especially because martial players will either get multiple attacks or great benefits to their attacks on top of being able to add ability bonuses to each swing, actually usually ends up being a lot more single target damage than most spellcasters can do. And single target damage is usually a little bit more beneficial in D&D combat. Now, of course, there's always those scenarios where you go into combat in a very RP sense and try to talk your way out of something or sneak past something. All those are completely valid and a lot of fun, and I constantly encourage players to do it. But for the argument of this topic, we're talking about strictly the combat mathematical mechanics side of things. So the reason I think people assume that martials are a little bit weaker is because as levels start to go up, right? Like first level between a fighter and a wizard has a lot of different options of spells. They can't cast that many, and their cantrips usually aren't too interesting yet. And of course, fighters can usually just like swing or shoot a bow, whatever. The differences between those two aren't much at all in terms of your choice, in terms of your effective choice. We're going to talk a lot about choice and effective choice because those are two different things. But as players start leveling up and spellcasters start getting access to higher level spell slots, every time they get a higher level spell slot or access to one, they unlock a whole new library of different abilities that they get to try. That gives you a lot of choice. And because different level spells are supposed to, like every third level spell is supposed to be around the same effectiveness, there's a lot of choice to choose from. When martials continue to level up, there are certain abilities that they get, but 9 times out of 10, those abilities are either to support them using the attack action, or if they replace the attack action, they're not as effective as the attack action. And I think as players start to level up, that's when it starts to seem that martials aren't as effective, because you are still effective in the one thing you do best, which is swinging a weapon or shooting a bow or whatever. But it starts to feel like you can't do much to participate, because the most effective thing you can do is the one thing you've been doing since level 1. To help kind of prove my point that I think that's the case, of people actually just getting a little bored of the martial routine rather than it actually being ineffective, is the fact that if you ask anyone who enjoys playing a fighter, 9 times out of 10, if you ask them their favorite subclass, they're going to say it's Battlemaster. Now, for those of you who don't know, Battlemaster is one of the starting subclasses you can get in the Player's Handbook for 5th edition. But the thing that makes them unique is the fact that they get something called superiority dice, which if you take away all the words, right? Take away all the theming, take away all the words, essentially it's another pool of resources that allows your character to do different abilities. If you take away the words, like we just said, that's essentially what spell slots are too. It's another resource to manage that allows you to do different things. And since there are more options, different things you can do, that gives you some more choice, effective choice even. So using the superiority die usually allows you to do some sort of maneuver or spell. Like tripping an opponent, pushing them back, and usually that superiority die will also add damage or attack or something. The fact that every time you get to swing your sword, if you have superiority dice available, it allows you to have some sort of choice in that attack, right? Goading attack is another really interesting one. It's the closest thing to simulate a taunt mechanic that is in like World of Warcraft, of making the opponent want to attack you more than your party. But for most subclasses, they don't have something like that. Or they don't change, or they don't have that much of it to really feel like you have a variety and choice. While attacking will always be effective when you're one of these martial players, after a while, it starts to feel lame when you get to see your spellcaster friends like turn a dragon into a chicken, or teleport with a friend, or literally do anything else that can synergize with the other party members. So on top of them not being able to do a lot more utility abilities as a martial class, there's not a lot of synergy with other classes too, other than maybe a flanking mechanic with a rogue to give them sneak attack or whatever. In general, the options you have for more extensive gameplay as a martial class seems limited, especially the higher level you go. Now, while that seems like a huge nerf, right? I think it's also an accessibility trait. So the fact that martial classes, let's take a level 20 champion fighter, right? The mechanics that they have on top of the normal fighter base set isn't that much more, which I think is why newer players start to gravitate towards those classes like fighter, barbarian, especially like barbarian, who can take so much damage. It allows players to go through mistakes, right? Like barbarians can try some crazy stuff, and if it doesn't work out and they get hit a bunch of times, they'll most likely be able to take it. But again, that doesn't add a whole lot of variety, which is why I think some players just tend to get bored of those classes as they get higher levels, or they start wanting to explore more homebrew or very eccentric subclasses, or even start trying to dip into multiclassing just to get a little more variety of the game, especially if it's one of their first characters. So I think especially sometimes for new players, it can be very beneficial to have a martial class that might not have too much going on, so that they can kind of get the general routine of the game, right? But over time, if they start to pick up the game quickly, they might find that boring. So here's some ways I think you can fix that. A lot of times I usually fix that with magic items. Now, I don't mean just like power, because like, again, I think the mistake is that people think martials are weaker when in fact they're not weaker. They just don't have as much fun choices. So I like to give them not just magic items that increase how much damage they do, but magic items that essentially unlock new abilities for them, such as like a ring that allows them to maybe cast a spell a couple times a day or once a day, depending on the power level of it. But just different abilities, maybe blessings, boons, different homebrew things that you can grant these martial classes so they get to play around with spells or other things that they can maybe use more creatively, right? Like giving a barbarian a ring to give them dimension door once a day. Like you'd be surprised of like what the things they'll try to do with that in the middle of combat or even outside of combat, right? I think sometimes spells, and like there's so many of them, right? It's like half of the player's handbook. Those have a lot more effectiveness outside of combat, which can sometimes make role playing a little bit more fun for spellcasters than martial classes. While, punching something, lifting something, or intimidating someone as a martial class can be effective, but might get old a little more quickly. So in general, I try to either give abilities or give magic items, just to give them a little bit more uniqueness and choice, not necessarily power levels. Another way to make martial classes, I think, a little bit more effective and fun is to design encounters around a way that they can be more effective. For example, if you made an encounter that has a bunch of baddies, but you also need to make sure this elevator shaft doesn't fall to the ground that has hostages on it. I don't know, I'm making this up as I go. But now a barbarian can go and try to like use a pulley system to get the elevator higher rather than just doing combat. So using the strengths that they do have to have those martial classes do something different in combat rather than just hitty punchies. But essentially, that's kind of what I found out on most of my research on trying to figure out whether martial classes are actually weaker than spellcasters. They're really not in terms of what the CR system considers to be weak, and that the CR system mostly focuses like damage output and defensive abilities. So I think there's sometimes a bit confusion in some people when they're like, I feel so weak, when their spellcaster might be using their spells very creatively and getting a lot of output out of them. The creativity floor of a martial class just might not be as high for someone who isn't used to using a martial class. So I think there are things your DM can do and should do to help make martials feel a little bit more fun and give you at least a bouncing block of creativity. But with that, I think we'll go on to our third and final topic, and I'm going to share with you a magic item I've created. I've created this magic item specifically based off of the topic we just talked about, right? A lot of magic items, especially magic weapons that are given to martial classes, usually will have some sort of effect, but something that usually just increases the power, increases how much damage they do, or gives them some sort of ultimatum. Regardless, I think magic items and magic weapons that give you some sort of some choice built into the item ends up being more fun, right? We've talked about a little bit of the difference between choice and effective choice. So like when if you're trying to give martial classes more choice and you just give them a weapon that does more damage, you're actually a little bit, mechanically anyways, limiting their effective choice. So if the problem you're facing is that your marshals feel like all they can do is attack, and then you only give them items that make them attack better, well, then the problem still exists in the fact that they feel like they can't do anything else other than attack, right? If now by making their attack stronger, anything else they could have even possibly tried is now weaker because the one thing they do well is just better. So this is the item I've made. I call it the Dragon Ender Longsword. It's supposed to be a variation of the Dragon Slayer Longsword. The Dragon Slayer Longsword being a very powerful and iconic magical item that does 3d6 additional damage if it hits a dragon. Again, which is proving the point I was making before of increasing the separation between your choices, and by making your attack action the only really effective choice. So what I'll pull it up on screen. But this is a magic item you can go download right now. With my very limited Photoshop skills, I've made a little card that you can print out, cut cut in half, fold in half, put into a little card sleeve, and then have a little hand-outable item you can give your players. So for those of you watching on YouTube, I'll pull it up on the screen now, but if you're not, if you're listening, I'm going to explain what the item does. So it is a weapon of any sort. I put it as a very rare, and it requires a very rare magic item, and it requires attunement. Base stats, you gain a +2 bonus to attack and damage on rolls made with this magic weapon. Very generic for most magical weapons. I feel like if you get a magic weapon into a martial class's hand and it doesn't give you some sort of bonus to attack and damage, people will be disappointed. But the unique choice that this thing provides you is, while holding this sword, you can use a bonus action to empower your next attack with it that hits a dragon with one of the following effects. So basically, very similar to a smite spell a paladin would use, you can use your bonus action to empower the blade's next attack with a certain effect. Those two effects are either slay or sunder. If you use the slay empowerment, the dragon takes additional damage equal to a number of d6 times your proficiency bonus for that attack. So if you choose to slay, you're just going to do more damage output. So that is still an option for you. Or you can use sunder. If you empower your weapon with sunder, the dragon cannot attempt to recharge its breath weapon on its next turn. So now, because you get to choose between one of these two abilities, you essentially have a little more strategic thinking required before using it, right? So if you're just trying to burn this dragon down, which a lot of people, that is an effective strategy in 5th edition, you can just constantly use the slay empowerment every turn, especially if you know the dragon is weak and its turn is coming up, and see if you can get it killed in one hit. Sunder is a great way to make a more defensive choice, right? If the dragon just used its breath weapon on half your party, and knowing that the breath weapon of dragons are one of the most dangerous things about them, you might choose to allow that dragon to not be able to recharge its breath weapon next turn. So you can at least have that comfort in knowing that really hurt, but if I constantly use this, he won't do it again. I like this choice a little bit better. We're going to go into some of my reasonings behind this. I feel like a lot of the more interesting magic items that wizards provide usually lean on the crutch of, you can use this ability a number of times equal to your proficiency bonus modifier. That makes sense, right? Because then because your proficiency bonus is a stat that constantly, semi-constantly scales with your level, it makes a magic item that kind of scales with you, right? I think it's a little lazy and a little more cumbersome on the player. I think 5th edition has a problem with some of its classes and subclasses giving too many pools of resources. So any game, especially turn-based game that's not a video game, right? There's no reaction time, there's no physical abilities. If it's turn-based, then the skill that makes you better at the game is how well you manage your resources. And I think 5th edition, unfortunately, gives you too many resource pools, even a generic paladin, right? You have your hit points, you have your spell slots, you have your lay on hands points, you have the amount of times you can use divine sense, you have your divine channel divinity charges. Like, that's already so many resources that you have to manage, and like, wait, where do I put that down? Where do I mark that down? Do I get that on a short rest or a long rest? I think having magic items just give you another pool of resource, so you have a weapon that can do a thing times your proficiency bonus a day. That's just another thing you have to track, and it feels clunky and sloppy to me. But your action economy is the one resource that's not hard to manage, right? Because it's a fixed resource. You get it every turn. So using that resource to make a decision between one or two things or multiple, I think is a more easy and effective way to give your players additional choice without giving them like more homework to track. So using your bonus action for one of two abilities every turn, I think is beneficial, right? So either pumping out more damage, which is always satisfying, or using the more defensive choice by preventing the dragon from using its breath weapon again, also is a defensive choice not only for you, but for the rest of your party. So this is just a way that marshals can have a little bit more decision making and fun during dragon fights. I think it's Dungeons and Dragons, right? So we eventually want our players to fight a dragon, but unless they're fighting them in a cave or some sort of lair, like there's always the trouble of the dragon just flying away. And if your martial classes are primarily melee based, then you usually have to come up with some way that they can bring them down or whatever. So I think this way, it's like whenever that player can actually get to a dragon, they now have some sort of strategic decision to make other than like, oh, finally I got to the dragon. I guess I'll just swing again. That's a long way of saying like, I think it's worth taking the time if you're making homebrew items to give some sort of choice in the item, right? I don't think taking away a powerful magic item's ability to balance it is the way to do it. But I think giving them some choice in how many different ways you can use it is how your players will be more engaged with that magic item. But that is pretty much the show. The Dragon Ender Sword you can get in the description below or in the show notes. Wherever you're consuming this content, I'll make sure the link is accessible to you. It'll take you to my Gumroad page. At the time of recording, it's the only thing on there. But ideally, in the future, I would like to try to give you some sort of either a printable magic item or subclass or monster every show. So go ahead, check that out. If you're watching this super in the future, hopefully there's more on there for you to download and enjoy. But if you end up using it in your game, let me know how you liked it. If you think it's crap, you can tell me that too. Just tell me why it's crap, because I'm all about learning and getting better. That's our first show. We did it. We recorded the whole thing. And if you enjoyed it, well, be sure to like it and come back and see it again. With that, remember to always be a dungeon learner, not just a dungeon master. And I will see you all next time. Thanks. Bye.